Thank you very much. Good morning. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to give you this short talk that will last about 15 minutes. And of course, I would like to thank everyone who is with us today, both here and online from other countries. I'm going to talk briefly about the first pillar, pay-as-you-go pensions in Europe, which are the perspectives we have and what are European countries doing to face the challenge of aging in the pay-as-you-go pension, the first pillar, and what lessons can be learned for Latin American countries. I always like to start, when I speak about the challenge we have ahead of us, the changes that we need to implement in our pension systems, I use this quote from Peter Diamond, Nobel Prize of Economy, who said that instead of trying and then seeking radical reforms of pension systems that have worked for decades, they have been provided an income that has allowed generations that when people retired could have a relatively good life. Instead of seeking those radical reforms, it is better to try to implement gradual changes, to anticipate things before they happen so that they continue to work properly. Why is this important? First of all, because this first pillar, particularly in Europe, is a basic pillar of the welfare state. We have education, health, but also the pension system. Pension systems, in principle, are viable and sustainable, this first pillar, but obviously, as long as we adapt to changes that in some cases are significant, as we will see economic changes, social changes, demographic changes. It's not just aging, there are also economic and social changes that are very important. What we need to do is finding a twofold balance. They need to be effective, these changes, but they need to have effects. And then we need to strike a balance among generations and segments in our population. These changes are not simple, but also we're going to see that based on our experience, and this is an experience that we have in Europe, this economic, social, political project that we have, the EU, we know experiences from some countries, and we can use them as guidelines for these gradual changes that other countries that are lagging behind need to do. Well, lagging behind potentially because of a demographic change or a baby boom that happened after other countries. Actually, the changes that we need to do are a response to two very good news. First of all, we live more. We want to do changes not because we're living less, because we're living more. And second, because after World War II, particularly in the 50s, Europe experimented a baby boom effect for a couple of decades. The growth rates were very high. And these generations are reaching their age of retirement with a very high life expectancy, higher than the ones their parents had, for example. So these are two very good pieces of news. But the thing is, how do we face this challenge? First of all, dependency ratios are virtually doubling over the next decades as a result of these two effects. Here we have the population over 65 years old and population between 20 and 64 in 2020. And here we have that same population in 2060. This diagonal line tells me in which countries this ratio is going to more than double or be close to double. But in almost all of them, it's going to increase. This is the case of Spain. In Spain, this ratio is going to more than double. Currently, there are approximately 32 people of population over 65 over the population that's active labor force, and this is going to 80, so it's a high
Tema de
percentage.
reparto, una cosa buena
So
pero
distribution,
bueno, yo
pay as you go
el
is
tema del reparto
good, but
recoge
there's a challenge
niveles
here. It takes
socioeconómicamente
income that
y
comes from contributions to
cotizaciones
social
de personas
security
trabajadoras
from
donde
people
se
that are
financian
working, and
las
with that
pensiones
we
de las
fund
personas que están
pensions
jubiladas.
of retired people.
Para que el sistema sea autosuficiente, lo que
In
se
order for
necesita son
this
menos
system to be
ingresos para trabajar.
self-sufficient,
Los
income and
ingresos sabemos que
expenses need to be
aproximadamente
equal,
representan un
and
porcentaje
income,
relativamente estable
they're quite a stable
del PIB.
percentage of the
Si no
GDP.
hay cambios
If there are
en
no
lo que son las tasas de
changes
cotización,
in
si no hay grandes
contributions,
cambios en
and if
la
there are no
participación de la
changes
renta,
in
no hay
income
compensación social y
participations, in social
el salario
contributions affect
es una
salaries, and salaries
parte
represent
fundamental del
more or less
desarrollo
stable
económico,
percentage of the
pues
GDP.
hay bastante estabilidad, es
There's
decir, el envejecimiento, los cambios
there's quite a lot of
demográficos, el
stability,
desarrollo
aging,
prácticamente no afecta
social
a
demographic
los niveles
changes
del Producto Interior Bruto.
virtually
Pero en las
don't
pensiones sí. Y podemos
affect
hacer una
the
composición muy
income
sencilla.
and
Pues
GDP,
partir de una
but
identidad,
pension expense does.
pueden ver que
Pension
en el fondo
expenditure.
tenemos
It's quite
una,
simple to see
tenemos en esta descomposición de aquí,
in
esta es
this
la única fórmula
breakdown.
que voy a
This
utilizar.
is the only formula that we're
Vais de
going
la
to use.
posición de
You
las
see
pensiones sobre el Producto
the
Interior Bruto,
pension
lo que estoy haciendo es
expenditure on
multiplicar y
GDP.
dividir
I'm just going to multiply
distintas
and divide
variables
using
y lo
different
que tenemos aquí
variables.
es la
And
tasa de
here we have the
dependencia.
dependency
Cuando aumenta
ratio.
la población jubilada
The
sobre
retired
la población que
population
ha
is
de
going to
trabajar,
increase
la tasa
over
sobre
the
el
labor
cual
force.
cuántas pensiones va a
The
recibir
coverage
la
ratio,
población que tiene edad
pensions
de
received by
jubilar,
that
la tasa de
retired
prestación, cuál es
population, the
el ratio entre
benefit
la pensión
ratio, the
media
ratio
y
between
la
the
productividad, y
average
por
pension
último
and productivity,
un
and
ratio
last
que es
but
la
not
tasa
least, a ratio which
la
is
inversa, la tasa
the
de empleo
reverse of the
real.
employment
Bien, pues
ratio,
una de las
actually.
ventajas que tiene esta
One
descomposición
of the
es que cada
advantages
uno de
of
estos
this
cuatro
breakdown is
gremios
that each of these four
matemáticamente
parts,
decimos
mathematically,
que
we say
tiene una elasticidad unitaria. ¿Esto
that
qué
they
quiere
have
decir? Para que se
unity
entienda, es
elasticity. What does this
mantener
mean?
constante cada uno de los
If
términos
each
que aparecen en
part
las
is
ecuaciones.
kept
Si uno de ellos
constant,
cambia, por
if
ejemplo,
one
un
of them
10%,
changes, let's
pues
say
las compensaciones
10%,
aumentan en
the
la proporción
pension expenditure will change in the
adecuada.
same
Bien,
proportion,
bueno, pues vamos a
10%.
ver, porque esto ya lo ha dicho
Let's see,
el
because
equipo
this
de
has been
Doménech,
mentioned
la
before,
presidenta de IOPA.
the
En
president of
realidad solo
IOPA.
hablamos de Europa, pero en Europa hay
We
muchas
speak about Europe, but in Europe there are many
explicarlas, pero
differences.
vamos a ver
It's very heterogeneous. We're going to see this
durante las próximas láminas.
in my
Tasa
next
de
slides.
dependencia,
Dependency
gasto
ratio,
en pensiones. Tasa de
pension
dependencia
expenditure,
horizontal, gasto en pensiones en el eje vertical.
dependency
Bueno, pues aquí
ratio
tenemos, esto es la velocidad
horizontal,
unitaria, esto es
pension
si todos los
expenditure
países
vertical.
estuvieran
This is the line.
ordenados sobre
If
esta,
all the
sobre
countries were
recta
on
y
this
extensiva,
line with a
pues
positive
prácticamente no observaríamos diferencias, pero ¿qué pasa?
inclination, we wouldn't see
Vemos que
differences,
hay países
but
que
we
con
do.
la misma
We see
tasa
that there
de
are countries
dependencia
that, with the
tienen un gasto en
same
pensiones
dependency
muy
ratio,
superior
their
al resto.
pension expenditure
Bueno,
is much
significa que
higher,
los
or
otros
the opposite.
componentes
That means that
están
the other
haciendo
components
su labor.
are
En cualquier caso, la
doing
tasa de dependencia
something.
explica una
Anyway,
parte
dependency ratio
no
explains
muy
part
importante,
of
no
these
un 20%,
differences, not
mayor al
very
75%,
significant, less than
y por lo
20%,
tanto el resto de los
17%.
factores pues, explican
So
lo
the
demás.
rest of the factors
Una
explains
relación
this bigger
creciente,
percentage.
pero
An increasing relation,
muy
but
estrecha. La
not
tasa de
close.
cobertura,
The
cuando
coverage
vemos la tasa de
ratio,
cobertura, es
I would like to
cuántas
remember,
personas,
this
cuántas
is
pensiones
how
están
many
pagadas,
pensions
¿no?
are
Está pagando
being
el sistema de reparto
paid by
de las
the
personas
pay-as-you-go
de la población mayor de
system.
65 años. También hay enormes
We
diferencias.
see
Hay
huge
países
differences
incluso
too. There are
que
countries
están prácticamente en el 1,
that
otros que
are
están
virtually in
por
1,
encima
others
del
are
1,5. De
above
nuevo, la
1.5.
relación es creciente, pero aquí
Again, it's an
todavía
increasing
la tasa de cobertura
relation,
explica
but the
menos
coverage
de los
ratio
otros porque es
explains
el
just
gasto de dependencia.
2% of this
Con diferencia,
expenditure.
la variable que más
The
explica
variable
es
that
la tasa de
explains it the
prestación.
most is
Hay
the benefit
diferencias, de
ratio.
nuevo,
There are differences
tasa de
again.
prestación, esto
The benefit ratio,
es muy importante
this is
porque
very
lo que
important.
estamos diciendo aquí es
What
que
we're saying
estamos
here
haciendo
is
el
that
cálculo de la
the
pensión media
benefit
sobre
ratio is the average pension and average productivity or average salary. What we're saying is that there are countries such as Greece, Italy, Spain, or Portugal, well, the pressure of this represents about 60%, and others, for example, Nordic countries, Sweden or the Netherlands, or even Germany, Denmark, it's 40% or less than 40%. So there are differences in the benefit ratio, the benefit rate for many countries. And this explains almost half the differences we see across countries. And last but not least, the employment rate. Here, it's inverse relationship, adverse relation, because the higher it is, well, this means that GDP is higher and pension expenditure represents a smaller percentage of GDP. And here we have countries such as Greece, Italy, or Spain with reduced employment rates. Nordic country, Central Northern Europe, they have high rates. That's why their expenditure, their pension expenditure is below GDP. And this is telling us two things. In order to avoid this increase in pension expenditure over GDP in the future, we can do two things, which is reducing dependency ratio, increasing the retirement age, reducing what we call the generosity of the pension system. And in economic terms, we have to try to increase the employment rate and have this employment to be as productive as possible. If productivity is higher, even though the rate goes down, pensions could be higher. What do we expect up to 2050 with the policies that have been approved so far by the different countries? These cycles represent how much the pension expenditure is going to increase or decrease in terms of GDP. This graph tells me that Romania, which is in one of the ends, this pension expenditure over GDP is going to increase a lot, almost 7% with the current policies. The other end, we have Denmark. Their pension expenditure is going to drop about 2 points because what they've chosen to do within these gradual adjustments, they've decided to gradually extend the age of retirement. They're going to extend it a lot. But we see a high degree of heterogeneity here when we see what the countries are going to do. If we break down this way, this increase in the pension expenditure, we see that all of them are going to have an increase in general of the dependency rate due to aging, the retirement of baby boom generation, the increase of life expectancy, and almost all of them are trying to reduce either the coverage ratio and more particularly the benefit rate. But sometimes when changes are approved, a decade later, 2 decades later, they may be reversed. This is what's going on here in Spain right now. A reform was approved back in 2013. It limited the increase of the pension expenditure because it cancelled the increase of the dependency ratio with a strong decrease of the benefit rate. But the counter-reform that has been implemented today, this decrease of the benefit rate disappears and Spain is here. So right now, there's no decrease of the benefit rate, and as a consequence, the pension expenditure is going to increase around 4 points. Sometimes reforms take place in the right direction, and sometimes there are counter reforms that go in the opposite direction, and the expenditure increases. All this means that the system, in general terms, well, either social contributions increase income, or they will need to pay pensions with taxes charged to other generations, so that creates an intergenerational unbalance. What are some countries doing, but very heterogeneously? Some countries, they've planned an increase of the retirement age right now. Almost all of them is 65, but for 2050, the most extreme case is Denmark, from 65 to 72.
¿de acuerdo? 7 años
7 years.
más, ¿no? Hay
7 years
un
more.
trabajo muy interesante que hizo la OCDE hace
There was a very
3
interesting
años,
study carried out by
que lo que
OECD
preguntaba era
2-3
de
years ago,
acuerdo con las proyecciones
and they asked
demográficas
themselves,
que
according
se
to the
proyectan,
demographic
en cuánto
forecast
debería
that
aumentar la
we
edad de
have, how much
jubilación
would we need
para
to
evitar el
increase the
aumento de
age
la
of
tasa de
retirement
dependencia.
to
Y lo
prevent
que nos
an
venían
increase
a
in the
decir,
dependency
por
ratio.
ejemplo, un país como España,
And a country such as
tiene previsto
Spain,
aumentar 2 años
that
la edad de
expects to
jubilación,
increase the age of retirement in 2 years,
necesitaría aumentar
would
en
need
11 años
to
la tasa,
increase
perdón, la edad de jubilación
the
para
age
mantener constante
of retirement in 11 years
la
to
tasa de dependencia.
keep
Desde
dependency
que,
ratio constant.
salvo Francia y
Except for
Dinamarca,
France and
salvo Francia y
Denmark,
Dinamarca, los cambios previstos,
the
los aumentos de tasa de
changes,
jubilación,
the
son
increases in the age of retirement are
insignificantes
not
para el
enough
aumento de la tasa de
to
dependencia. Por eso la tasa de dependencia
offset
en casi
the
todos los
dependency
países
ratio. That's
está
why the dependency
aumentando
ratio is increasing in all the countries, or
¿Qué
we
más están
expect
haciendo
it to
los
do so.
países? Y
What
esto es
other things are
proyecciones que
countries
hemos
doing?
presentado
And these are
para
lessons that
introducir
we can
mecanismos de
learn.
ajuste
They're
automáticos a las
introducing
pensiones.
automatic
Pues
adjustment
hay muchos
mechanisms for
indicadores de
pensions,
sostenibilidad
or what we
en la que la
know,
pensión
what's known
inicial
as sustainability
se
factors,
calcula
so that the initial
mientras la
pension is
pérdida
based on
mientras
life expectancy. If life
aumenta
expectancy
la pensión
increases,
inicial disminuye
the
o
pressure
termina la edad de jubilación a
decreases,
la
or
edad
the
pensión.
age of retirement
Y
is
al
linked to
vivir
life
más,
expectancy. The
la
longer
pensión
we live,
va aumentando, ¿no? Y por lo tanto, bueno,
the
ven aquí
more
que hay un poco de
life
todo,
expectancy is
porque
increasing.
Europa es muy
So we have
diversa,
a bit of everything. Europe is very
unos más
diverse.
con
There are
mecanismos
countries that
automáticos, otros
use
más con la
automatic
combinación
adjustment
de la
mechanisms,
vida
or there's a
o la
combination of life expectancy
de jubilación.
or the
Y
increase in
luego
the
tenemos
age of
también
retirement.
mucha
And
diversidad
then
en
we
cuanto a
have a
los
lot of
criterios de
diversity
revalorización
regarding
de
the
las pensiones. Hay
revaluation
países en los que
criteria
esas
of pensions. In
revalorizaciones
some
van sujetas a
countries, that
reglas que se
revaluation
seleccionaron,
is not
hay otros
subject to
en
a
los
rule,
que
it's
hay que aparecer una
discretional.
P.
And others, when you see a P,
La
that
revalorización
means
en
that the
función
revaluation
de los créditos,
depends on the
cuando aparece
price.
una
When there's
doble
W,
exposición de lo que crecen los
it's
salarios y
based
caen
on
las
the
tasas de
increase in salaries.
referencia,
You see there are a lot of
pues
differences. There are countries
lo que crecen los
in
salarios,
which
pero
salaries grow, but 0.75
Y luego hay
basis
otros
points less.
países
And then there are
que
some
lo que
countries
hacen es
that what they're doing
hacer una
is
revalorización condicionada. Este es
reevaluating,
el caso de
conditioning.
Canadá y
This is the
Suecia.
case of Germany, the
Condicionada a la
Netherlands, and Sweden.
situación,
It's
al
conditioned
equilibrio
to the situation,
del
the
sistema.
balance of the
Si el
system.
sistema está en equilibrio, no tiene déficit,
If the system is balanced, it has no deficit, such as
de
Sweden,
acuerdo con este criterio.
according to this criteria. But you have to be careful looking at this. If there's a deficit, it's possible, and this has happened in some years, that revaluation is negative. Therefore, this is also a mechanism for adjustment, which is very important, with revaluation which is conditioned to the financial balance of the system. Basically, therefore, we can
Tres cosas, ¿no?
do three things.
Tenemos una tasa
If
de
we have a replacement rate which is very high,
mantener la tasa de
maintain the replacement rate at a high level if we do that, we protect the purchasing power of retired generations now and in the future to the cost of a readjustment which will affect taxpayers. If we protect the tax burden and if once people retire, their revaluation will depend on the economic situation or the financial system. This could mean that we see a drop over their life. And what we've seen in countries such as Sweden, this is the notional account system. This means that the initial pension is calculated in such a way as to guarantee their purchasing power ex ante at that time when they retire. And with that, I reach my conclusions. In general, what we are saying is that we are going to have to make a great effort over the next years in order to face this increase in pension costs. So we have those two pieces of news which are great. We live longer, and there are large generations retiring with a long life expectancy. We can do structural reforms, looking at increasing productivity, and everything we can do that can have an impact on the pension system. But what we're going to need is more complementary savings above all. Whatever we do, the pay-as-you-go systems are destined towards having lower benefit rates. And if that happens, if the pension is slower compared to average salary, if we're looking at a lower percentage of the salary that we've had whilst we were working, we have no choice but to have this system for compensating the reduction in the benefits by means of complementary savings in the third pillar, in the pillar of individual saving. And with that, I finished my presentation, and I thank you for your attention.